What happens when a bank robber treats crime like a science experiment? Not a desperate guy with shaky hands, or some loud gangster trying to look tough for the evening news. I'm talking about a man who studied statistics at an Ivy League university, a man trained in military tactics, a man who approached robbery the same way a chess grandmaster approaches a board. Every move calculated, every variable measured, every mistake eliminated before it could even happen. For nearly 30 years, one man quietly embarrassed the entire American justice system. More than 50 banks robbed. Over $2 million stolen in cash. No crew. No partner. No lookout. No bragging. No flashy lifestyle. And somehow, despite the FBI pouring years into the hunt, this man kept disappearing into the woods like some kind of horror movie creature. Federal investigators eventually gave him a nickname based on the tiny window of time he always seemed to strike. They called him the Friday Night Bank Robber. And the craziest part? This wasn't some street criminal who got lucky. This was Carl Gugasian, a man with a master's degree from the University of Pennsylvania, a trained statistician, a systems analyst, a third-degree black belt, a military-trained tactician. Basically the kind of guy your parents hoped you'd become, right up until the armed robbery part. But his story didn't start with some genius criminal master plan. It started with a disaster. A sloppy teenage mistake that nearly got him killed. And according to Gugasian himself, that moment completely shattered his belief in the American dream. Carl Gugasian was born in Pennsylvania in October of 1947 to hardworking Armenian immigrant parents. From an early age, people noticed something different about him. He was frighteningly intelligent. Teachers saw a kid who could process complex systems faster than most adults. Numbers clicked for him naturally. Patterns stood out immediately. He loved logic, structure, systems, probability. The human calculator type. But intelligence without direction can turn dangerous fast. And Carl had another side to him too. He was rebellious, restless, angry. The kind of teenager who always looked like he was mentally somewhere else while everyone around him was playing checkers. Then came the moment that changed everything. At just 15 years old, Carl decided to rob a candy store. It was clumsy, impulsive, and badly thought out. A scared teenager trying to force money out of a register. But the store owner wasn't interested in cooperating. He pulled a gun and shot him. Just like that. One terrible decision, and Carl Gugasian was lying there bleeding on the floor of a candy store before he was even old enough to drive legally. He survived the gunshot wound. But surviving turned out to be the easy part. The legal system came down hard on him. He was convicted and sent to Camp Hill State Youth Facility in Pennsylvania for 18 months. Now, for most teenagers, getting shot during a robbery and landing in juvenile detention would probably qualify as a life-changing wake-up call. For Carl Gugasian, it had the exact opposite effect. Camp Hill didn't rehabilitate him. It transformed him. Inside that facility, young Carl became obsessed with one idea. His future was over before it even began. Remember, this was the 1960s. A felony record back then felt permanent. Gugasian convinced himself that no respectable company would ever hire him. In his mind, every corporate office door in America had already slammed shut. Did he exaggerate that reality? Probably. But once someone truly believes the system has rejected them, dangerous things start happening in their head. Carl began thinking differently. If legitimate success was impossible, then he'd build success outside the system entirely. And somewhere inside that juvenile facility, he made a decision that would shape the next 3 decades of American criminal history. He was going to become a professional bank robber. But not some reckless thug sprinting into banks screaming at terrified tellers. No. If he was going to do this, he would do it perfectly. Mathematically. Scientifically. He would remove luck from the equation entirely. No mistakes. No improvisation. No chaos. Everything would be engineered. And before he ever robbed his first bank, he spent years preparing himself like a man training for war. Carl understood something most criminals never do. Bank robbery isn't really about courage. It's about control. Control of fear. Of movement. Control of timing. Control of people. You lose control for even a few seconds, and your life is over. So he began building himself into someone capable of dominating a room instantly. The problem was, Carl wasn't physically imposing. He stood about 5'6", not exactly the towering movie villain type. So instead of relying on size, he focused on speed, precision, and explosiveness. He immersed himself in martial arts with obsessive intensity. Thousands of hours of brutal training. While other people spent weekends relaxing, Carl was drilling strikes, balance, leverage, reflexes, conditioning. Eventually, he earned a third-degree black belt in Wei-Chiryu karate. His compact frame became fast, disciplined, and dangerous. But he still needed more. He needed tactical knowledge, weapons training, survival skills, movement under pressure. Books weren't enough for that. So in 1971, Carl Gugasian joined the United States Army. At Fort Bragg, he absorbed everything: weapons handling, tactical movement, operating in darkness, navigation through rough terrain, stress management under high-pressure situations. He learned how trained professionals move through environments without panic. And while he was building himself physically, he was also sharpening his mind academically. After military service, Gugasian attended Villanova University studying electrical engineering. Then he got accepted into the University of Pennsylvania. Yes, an Ivy League school. There, he earned a master's degree in systems analysis. Later, he pursued advanced doctoral work in statistics and probability at Penn State. To classmates and professors, Carl looked like a quiet academic with a promising future. A smart guy buried in equations and research papers. Nobody around him realized those equations were eventually going to help him rob banks more efficiently than anyone in American history. Because Carl wasn't studying systems analysis to climb the corporate ladder. He was studying systems so he could break them. He analyzed banking infrastructure the way a predator studies prey. Police response times, human behavior under stress, traffic flow patterns, geographic vulnerabilities, environmental concealment. While most criminals relied on adrenaline, Carl relied on data. And slowly, over years of obsessive preparation, the Friday night bank robber was born. By the early 1970s, he was no longer the impulsive teenager who got shot robbing a candy store. Now he was something entirely different. An Ivy League-educated statistician with military training and martial arts discipline who viewed armed robbery as a solvable mathematical equation. And once he finally started robbing banks, the FBI had absolutely no idea what they were dealing with. Welcome to the Heist Vault. Behind every heist there's a story. Some end in prisons, some end in graves, and some simply disappear. Most bank robbers think the perfect escape route is a highway. Fast car. Straight road. Full speed. Makes sense, right? Carl Gugasian thought that idea was completely stupid. To him, highways were death traps. Too many police. Too many choke points. Too many witnesses. Too predictable. The second a bank alarm goes off, where do cops look first? Roads. Highways. Intersections. On-ramps. That's where every fleeing suspect in history usually goes. So Carl decided he wouldn't escape through the road system at all. He would disappear into nature. Long before Google Maps existed, before satellite imagery, before people casually checked terrain from their phones. Carl spent endless hours in libraries studying detailed topographical maps from the United States Geological Survey. And he studied them obsessively. He wasn't looking for highways. He was looking for woods, dense tree cover, drainage systems, elevation changes, natural concealment. He developed an incredibly strict set of rules for choosing targets. First, the bank had to be located on the outskirts of town, quiet suburban or rural areas only. Second, and this was absolutely critical, the rear of the bank needed direct access to thick woods. Not a tiny patch of trees. Not decorative landscaping. Real forest. He wanted darkness, terrain, and concealment. No neighborhoods directly behind the woods. No bright parking lots. No fences slowing him down. Just immediate access to wilderness. Once he found a suitable target, the real preparation began. And this is where Carl Gugasian separated himself from basically every other robber in America. Because he solved the biggest problem in armed robbery. Evidence. See, escaping the bank is only half the battle. The real danger comes afterward. If police stop your vehicle and find a gun, a mask, and a bag full of stolen cash sitting beside you, congratulations, your future now belongs to the federal government. Carl decided he would never allow himself to be caught physically holding evidence. So days, sometimes weeks, before a robbery, he would hike deep into the woods behind the target bank carrying a shovel and a large PVC pipe with waterproof caps. There, hidden beneath leaves and dirt, he buried underground storage containers. Inside those containers, he could stash weapons, disguises, clothing, and eventually stolen cash. Completely hidden. Completely waterproof. Completely invisible. And then he added another layer. Sometimes he staged dirt bikes deep in the woods. Sometimes mountain bikes. Other times he mapped long hiking routes leading to a completely normal car parked miles away in another town. While police searched roads for speeding suspects, Carl planned to become just another ordinary guy driving home. That was the brilliance of it. The robber vanished. The normal citizen appeared. And nobody connected the two. By the time Carl Gugasian finished designing his getaway system, he had essentially turned bank robbery into a military extraction exercise. But geography alone wasn't enough. Timing mattered just as much. Maybe even more. Because robbing a bank in broad daylight creates problems fast. Too many witnesses. Too much traffic. A lot of visibility. Carl needed darkness. But banks usually close before dark. So once again, the statistician started studying patterns. Not criminal patterns. Astronomical ones. He analyzed sunset times across the eastern seaboard during late autumn and winter. And eventually, he noticed something almost absurdly perfect. During the colder months, darkness arrived early. By around 5 p.m., entire suburban areas were already swallowed in night. At the same time, many banks stayed open late on Fridays so working people could cash checks before the weekend. That created a tiny golden window. For roughly 1 hour every Friday evening during winter, banks were full of cash. Still open. Staffed by exhausted employees. Surrounded by darkness. To Carl Gugasian, this wasn't luck. It was a perfectly engineered vulnerability in the American banking system. And he intended to exploit it over and over again. That's how he earned the name. The Friday night bank robber. But timing and escape routes still weren't enough. Carl knew something else most criminals overlook. The moment you enter a bank with a weapon, psychology becomes your greatest tool. You don't actually need to shoot people to control them. You just need to make their brain believe violence is inevitable. And Carl became frighteningly good at that. Most robbers throw on a ski mask and call it a day. Carl hated ski masks. Too human. That's how he saw it. A teller looking at a nervous guy in a ski mask still sees a person. They can study body language, eye movements, fear. Carl wanted something deeper. He wanted pure shock. He wanted the people inside the bank to feel like a nightmare had just walked through the door. So instead of simple disguises, he bought elaborate Halloween masks from novelty stores. Monsters, aliens, horror characters, deformed faces, Freddy Krueger-style stuff. But he didn't wear them casually. Of course not. This was Carl Gugasian. Everything had to be engineered. He customized the masks carefully so no skin showed. He widened eye holes for maximum peripheral vision. He adjusted the fits so they stayed tight while moving fast. Then he paired the masks with oversized winter clothing to distort his actual build. The result was terrifying. Witnesses later described him less like a man and more like some strange creature sprinting through the bank. Which, honestly, was exactly what he wanted. And then there was his signature movement. The thing investigators never forgot. The crab walk. Picture this. It's Friday evening. Almost closing time. Bank employees are mentally checked out already, thinking about dinner and the weekend. Outside, the parking lot is dark. Then suddenly, a masked figure explodes through the rear entrance from the woods. But instead of walking upright like a normal person, he immediately drops into a deep crouch and starts moving rapidly across the floor in this bizarre skittering motion. Witnesses later described it like watching an animal move. It completely unsettled people. And naturally, there was a reason for it. Actually, there were two. First, the crouched movement kept Carl below the level of the large bank windows. Anyone driving past outside will not even realize a robbery was happening. Second, and this was genius, it distorted eyewitness descriptions. Tellers consistently described the robber as unusually short, maybe even physically deformed. Carl weaponized perspective itself. He manipulated human perception the same way magicians manipulate attention. By the time witnesses tried describing him to the FBI, Their memories were already contaminated by fear and optical illusion. And then came the move that terrified employees most. The vault. Carl would sprint toward the teller counter and suddenly explode upward, leaping completely over it. Not climbing. Not awkwardly scrambling. Vaulting. Cleanly. Aggressively. Like someone trained to do it. Imagine sitting at work counting cash and suddenly a monster-faced figure launches over the counter directly into your workspace. Yeah, people handed over money pretty fast after that. And once he landed behind the counter, Carl barely spoke. No movie speeches. No dramatic threats or unnecessary yelling. He shoved a bag forward and pointed the weapon. That was enough. The speed alone shattered people psychologically. Employees panicked and emptied drawers almost immediately. Meanwhile, Carl had an internal countdown running in his head. Because he knew exactly how long he could stay before police response became dangerous. 2 minutes. That was his hard limit. Not around 2 minutes. Exactly. If he didn't get every dollar? Fine. He still left. That discipline is one reason he survived so long. Most robbers get greedy. Carl got out. Always. Then came the escape. And this is where the entire operation became almost surreal. The robbery would be over in less than 120 seconds. Carl would vault back over the counter, rush through the rear exit, and disappear into the woods before police even established a perimeter. By the time sirens approached, he was already deep inside the tree line, moving through darkness like he'd rehearsed it 100 times. Because he had. He knew every route. Every ditch, every slope, every turn. Eventually he'd reach one of his hidden underground caches. Then everything changed instantly. The monster disappeared. The robber disappeared. The evidence disappeared. Inside the buried PVC pipe went the gun, the mask, outer clothing, stolen cash. Everything sealed underground. Then Carl changed into ordinary clothes. No monster. No weapon. No suspicious bag. Now imagine the police perspective. Roadblocks are going up everywhere. Officers are stopping cars looking for an armed suspect, carrying cash. Meanwhile, Carl is calmly driving through traffic looking like a quiet middle-aged guy heading home from dinner. Even if police stopped him, they'd find absolutely nothing. No evidence. No probable cause. Nothing linking him to the robbery that just happened minutes earlier. That's what made him nearly impossible to catch. The physical robber ceased to exist within minutes. And Carl understood patience. He didn't immediately recover the money. He waited. Sometimes for weeks. He'd let the investigation cool off completely before quietly returning to retrieve the buried cash. No rush. And that discipline allowed him to repeat the same system again. And again. And again. Year after year. Bank after bank. The FBI was chasing a ghost. No fingerprints. No useful witness descriptions. No reliable patterns beyond Friday nights and wooded areas. Investigators couldn't understand how someone kept vanishing so completely. He rarely spoke, and when he did, he used short, aggressive, completely accentless barks. Linguistic analysts had absolutely no vocal patterns to track. They weren't hunting a normal robber. They were hunting a man who treated crime like advanced systems engineering. And here's the scary part. Carl wasn't just robbing banks successfully. He was improving. Every operation refined the system further. Every escape taught him something. Every close call produced adjustments. He approached robbery the same way software engineers approach updates. Version after version after version. More efficient. More controlled. More precise. And while the FBI kept searching for some reckless career criminal, Carl continued living quietly in plain sight. By day, he looked like an educated academic. A polite, intelligent man with degrees and technical knowledge. Nobody around him suspected that on certain Friday nights, he transformed into a scary animal, and became one of the most successful bank robbers in American history. And honestly, that double life came with a psychological cost. Because maintaining secrecy at that level requires isolation. Carl couldn't really trust people. Couldn't get too close. Couldn't risk someone stumbling across maps, weapons, manuals, or strange equipment. He lived inside his own compartmentalized world. One side respectable. One side buried in the woods wearing monster masks. And for nearly 30 years. It worked. Perfectly. Until one tiny, unpredictable variable entered the equation. something no statistical model could account for. Two teenage boys, walking through the woods. There's a dangerous illusion that starts happening when someone gets away with crime long enough. At first, they're careful because they're scared. Then they succeed once. Then twice. Then 10 times. And eventually, the impossible starts feeling normal. That's the trap. Not greed. Not arrogance. Predictability. Carl Gugasian had built one of the most disciplined criminal systems America had ever seen. But the longer he operated successfully, the more his life revolved around maintaining that machine. And maintaining it was exhausting. He was a successful criminal, but his life was not about champagne or luxury houses. He lived modestly. Quiet apartment. Old vehicles. Low profile. His neighbors saw an educated, polite, slightly reserved guy who seemed more interested in books than attention. Meanwhile, hidden behind walls and buried underground across the Northeast, were stacks of stolen cash and enough tactical gear to make investigators stare in disbelief years later. But to understand just how disciplined Carl really was, you have to understand how seriously he treated preparation. This man didn't casually plan robberies. He practically rehearsed them like Broadway productions. Before his earliest robberies in the 1970s, Carl spent months scouting potential targets. Not days. Months. He drove thousands of miles across the East Coast examining bank locations with almost obsessive precision. A bank could look perfect initially, then get rejected because the tree line sat 30 feet too far from the rear exit. Another would fail because nearby traffic patterns created too much unpredictability. One extra streetlight? Rejected. Too many houses nearby? Rejected. A stop sign in the wrong place? Rejected. Carl refused compromise. That's what separated him from ordinary criminals. Most robbers adjust themselves to the target. Carl adjusted nothing. Targets must perfectly fit his formula. And once he finally selected a location, the surveillance phase began. This part sounds less like bank robbery and more like a military reconnaissance mission. At night, Carl would park miles away and hike through freezing woods carrying supplies. Then he'd set up hidden observation points behind banks. And he'd just watch. For hours. Motionless. He tracked employee routines, cleaning schedules, lighting conditions, traffic flow, blind spots, police presence. He memorized layouts through windows. He timed movement patterns with stopwatches. He practiced escape routes repeatedly in darkness. And he rehearsed relentlessly. If he tripped during a practice run through the woods, he repeated the route. If his sprint time wasn't fast enough, he repeated it again. He wanted muscle memory so deeply ingrained that panic would never enter the equation during the real robbery. By the time Carl entered a bank for real, he already knew the operation mentally. Every second. Every movement. Every exit angle. In his mind, the robbery had already happened dozens of times successfully before it actually occurred. That level of preparation is exactly why the FBI struggled for decades. Because Carl wasn't improvising under pressure. He was executing a rehearsed system. And then came 1981, the year the system almost collapsed. Until this point, Carl's robberies had relied heavily on intimidation rather than violence. Terrify people. Move fast. Get out. Simple. But one robbery in Pennsylvania changed everything. The target was a Fulton Bank branch in Susquehanna Township. For Carl, it checked every required box. Suburban location. Perfect wooded escape route. Minimal exposure. He prepared carefully like always. Buried the PVC cash. Mapped the terrain. Positioned the dirt bike. Then Friday night arrived. Carl pulled on the monster mask, rushed the bank, vaulted the counter, and started collecting cash. Everything was unfolding according to plan. Until suddenly, the bank manager made a move. Maybe panic. Maybe courage. Maybe instinct. Whatever it was, the manager lunged aggressively toward the masked robber. And in one split second, Carl's military reflexes took over. He fired. The bullet struck the manager in the abdomen. Everything changed instantly. The robbery transformed from controlled intimidation into chaos. The sound of gunfire accelerated everything. Employees panicked harder. Police response intensified faster. The timeline shattered. Carl fled immediately. But this time, the police response was already closing in around the rear of the bank. And then came the moment that nearly ended the Friday night bank robber forever. A Susquehanna Township police sergeant named Robert Bo McAllister arrived on scene. Now here's what's important. McAllister didn't approach casually. He anticipated the robber might escape through the rear near the woods. Which meant for the first time in years, someone disrupted Carl's escape formula. As Carl moved toward the tree line, Sergeant McAllister intercepted the area from the back side. Suddenly the statistician's carefully controlled equation exploded into unpredictability. Carl was trapped between the bank and an armed police officer. And Carl knew exactly what surrender meant. His entire life was over if he got caught there. So once again, he fired. The round struck Sergeant McAllister, severely wounding him. The officer collapsed. Carl disappeared into the darkness. It's honestly terrifying to think about. The man moved through freezing woods at night after shooting both a bank manager and a police officer, then still successfully completed his escape procedure. Reached the cache. Buried evidence. Changed clothes. Vanished. By the time investigators locked down roads and launched the manhunt, Carl Gugasian was already gone. Again. Both shooting victims survived. But the robbery shook investigators deeply. Because now they understood something important. This wasn't luck. This wasn't some amateur somehow surviving through coincidence. The discipline required to shoot under pressure, evade responding officers, navigate darkness, and disappear without evidence, pointed towards someone highly trained. Military trained. The FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit started rethinking everything. Especially an agent named Ray Carr, who would later become central to the hunt. Investigators began realizing the suspect likely possessed tactical training, advanced physical conditioning, exceptional discipline, strong understanding of police procedures. The robber's athletic vault over teller counters suddenly looked less random. His woodland escapes looked less improvised. The lack of evidence looked intentional. For the first time, the FBI started understanding they weren't chasing a desperate criminal. They were chasing a tactician, an apex predator. And honestly, that realization probably made the whole thing scarier. Because once investigators understand they're hunting someone intelligent and methodical, every unsolved robbery starts feeling heavier. Every mistake law enforcement makes starts feeling personal. And Carl knew they were learning. So he adapted again. After the 1981 shooting, Carl tightened his methods even further. He hated unpredictability. Violence complicated the system. Gunfire attracted too much attention. So he refined his intimidation tactics to ensure employees stayed compliant immediately. Faster entry. Faster control. Faster exits. And remarkably, he never fired his weapon again. He simply faded back into the shadows. Year after year, the robberies continued. And the FBI remained stuck in a frustrating cycle. They understood the profile better now. But they still had no identity. No fingerprints or reliable DNA. No meaningful witness descriptions. Nothing. Imagine spending decades hunting someone you know is out there. Who keeps succeeding. Someone intelligent enough to adapt every time law enforcement gets closer. And never even knowing his name. That was Carl Gugasian. A living statistical anomaly. And meanwhile, outside the robberies, his personal life became increasingly isolated. Because here's the thing nobody talks about enough. Maintaining a double life at that level destroys normal human connection. Carl couldn't fully relax around people. Couldn't share details. Couldn't form deep trust easily. He was constantly guarding the secret. Every conversation filtered. Every relationship compartmentalized. And as the years passed, his hidden criminal empire started resembling something almost tragic. Because despite stealing millions, he barely lived. Just secrecy. Routine. Isolation. And buried cash sitting underground in waterproof tubes. It's like he built the perfect criminal system, then accidentally trapped himself inside it. By the late 1990s, another problem was emerging. Technology. When Carl started robbing banks in the 1970s, security systems were primitive compared to modern standards. Cameras were grainy. Response systems were slower. Digital tracking barely existed. But times were changing. Surveillance quality improved dramatically. Police dispatch systems became faster and smarter. The margin for error kept shrinking. And Carl knew it. Remember, this man thought statistically. He understood probability better than almost anyone chasing him. Which meant he understood something terrifying. The longer he kept operating, the closer the odds moved toward failure. Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But eventually, randomness wins. And for the first time in decades, Carl Gugasian began seriously considering retirement. He'd stolen enough money to disappear quietly forever. He had already proven he could outsmart the FBI. He was getting older. His body required more maintenance to sustain the athletic demands of the robberies. And deep down, he knew the equation wouldn't stay perfect forever. He was closer than ever to walking away undetected. Closer than ever to becoming an unsolved legend. Then the universe introduced two teenage boys into the story. And everything collapsed. The downfall of Carl Gugasian didn't begin with some elite FBI tactical operation. No dramatic undercover sting. No genius detective connecting impossible clues on a giant evidence board. After nearly 30 years of outsmarting law enforcement, his empire started collapsing because of two bored teenagers wandering through the woods. And honestly, that almost makes the story feel cruel. Because after all the mathematical calculations, all the preparation, all the discipline, the thing he couldn't predict was random curiosity. It was 2001. Carl Gugasian was now in his 50s. Older. Slightly slower physically. But still operating with terrifying precision. In Radnor, Pennsylvania, two local teenage boys were exploring wooded areas near their neighborhood. Nothing unusual. Just kids killing time outdoors. At some point during their wandering, they came across an old drainage pipe partially hidden in the brush. The kind of thing most people would ignore immediately. But teenagers and terrible ideas have always been close friends. So naturally, they investigated. Using a flashlight, they looked deeper into the concrete tunnel. And that's when they noticed something strange buried inside. A long PVC pipe. Custom sealed. Hidden carefully in the darkness. Now imagine being those kids for a second. You crawl into some random wooded drainage tunnel expecting maybe trash or old beer cans. And instead discover what basically looks like a serial killer starter kit. Because when they opened the container, the contents were horrifying. Inside they found modified Halloween masks, a loaded 9mm handgun, ammunition, survival supplies, weapons manuals, detailed topographical maps marked with routes and notes. At that moment, those boys probably realized very quickly this wasn't some harmless hidden stash. Somebody dangerous put this there. And thankfully, instead of deciding to keep investigating like characters in a horror movie who absolutely deserve what happens next, the teenagers took everything straight to police. That single decision ended one of the longest-running robbery careers in American history. When investigators returned to the woods with the teenagers, they immediately understood the discovery was bigger than expected. Way bigger. Because once officers started digging around the area, they found a large underground. This wasn't one buried pipe. Investigators uncovered additional sealed containers filled with weapons, surveillance notes, escape plans, robbery equipment, newspaper clippings, bank target lists. The FBI got called in almost immediately. And you can only imagine the reaction. For decades, investigators had practically nothing. Now suddenly they were standing in the middle of a hidden criminal bunker belonging to America's most elusive bank robber. It was like discovering buried treasure for law enforcement. Except instead of gold, it was nightmares and evidence. And the craziest part? This wasn't even Carl's only cache. Investigators later discovered he maintained around 18 underground hide sites across the northeastern United States. 18. That level of preparation sounds less like robbery and more like a guy preparing for societal collapse. The deeper investigators dug, the more surreal everything became. The target lists alone stunned authorities. Carl had reportedly analyzed and cataloged more than 160 banks. 160. Think about the patience required for that. This wasn't chaotic criminal behavior. This was long-term strategic planning on an almost industrial level. And buried inside all that evidence were two critical clues that finally shattered the mystery. The first clue. Fingerprints. After nearly 30 years of leaving almost nothing behind, investigators successfully lifted prints from items inside the cache. The second clue was stranger. A brochure for a local Weichiryu karate school. At first glance, it probably looked insignificant. But FBI profilers understood something important. This robber had demonstrated extreme athleticism, discipline, controlled movement, tactical confidence. The martial arts connection mattered. So agents visited the karate studio directly. FBI agents approached the owner and described the type of man they were hunting. Short, athletic, disciplined, intelligent, interested in outdoorsmanship and weapons. The instructor apparently recognized the description almost immediately. Carl Gugasian. Just like that. 30 years of mystery suddenly had a name attached to it. Then the fingerprint results came back. Perfect match. The prints connected to a teenage candy store robbery suspect from the 1960s and a former U.S. Army serviceman. Everything snapped together instantly. The FBI finally knew who the Friday night bank robber was. And now the hunt became personal. Agents started tracking Carl quietly. And what they found must have felt bizarre after decades of imagining some hidden criminal mastermind. Because outwardly, Carl looked painfully ordinary. He lived quietly in suburban Philadelphia. Worked as an engineer and statistician. Polite. Educated. Low-key. You could probably sit beside him at a coffee shop and never suspect anything unusual. Meanwhile, this man had spent decades terrifying bank employees while sprinting through buildings in monster masks. That contrast is one of the creepiest parts of the entire story. The double life was almost perfect. But now the walls were closing in. And on February 7, 2002, it finally ended. Carl Gugasian visited the Free Library of Philadelphia. Which feels almost poetic considering libraries helped build his criminal career in the first place. Remember, this was where he spent years studying topographical maps and planning robberies. The same quiet intellectual environment that fueled his criminal system became the location of his capture. As Carl exited the library, FBI agents surrounded him. No chase. No shootout. No dramatic escape. After 30 years of vanishing into darkness and woods and highways, the Friday night bank robber was arrested in broad daylight on library steps. And somehow, that ending feels strangely fitting. The man who treated crime like an academic discipline got caught leaving a library. Now here's where the story takes another unexpected turn. Investigators expected Carl to fight hard. After all, this was a highly educated statistician with deep knowledge of systems and procedure. He was facing what amounted to a life-ending prison sentence. Over 100 years. The FBI probably prepared for a long legal war. Instead, Carl basically folded immediately. Not out of panic exactly. More like exhaustion. Imagine carrying a secret that massive for 3 decades. The constant paranoia. The compartmentalization. The isolation. Then suddenly it's over. No more hiding caches. No more planning routes. No more living 2 lives. According to investigators, Carl became shockingly cooperative. And not just partially cooperative. Completely. He confessed to robberies authorities already suspected. Then he confessed to additional robberies they hadn't even connected to him. He walked agents through his methods step by step. Explained the PVC pipes, the wooded escape systems, the scent-blocking spray used against K9 units, the psychological manipulation tactics, the timing formulas, the geographical selection process. The FBI essentially received a masterclass from the man who spent decades embarrassing them. And honestly, they realized his knowledge was too valuable to ignore. So the FBI did something extremely unusual. They asked Carl Gugasian to help train law enforcement. Yes. The Friday night bank robber literally helped educate the same system he spent 30 years defeating. Carl agreed. He participated in highly classified FBI training material explaining how sophisticated tactical criminals think and operate. Imagine being a rookie federal agent sitting in a training room watching America's most successful bank robber calmly explain why your investigative assumptions failed. That must have been surreal. And because of his extraordinary cooperation, the courts showed leniency. Instead of spending the rest of his life behind bars, Carl Gugasian received a sentence of 17.5 years. Still serious, but far less than expected considering the scale of his crimes. Thinking about that, was this part of the plan if he ever got caught? Was his cooperation part of the math? We will never know. I digress. Prison produced another strange transformation. For the first time in his adult life, Carl started using his intelligence in a constructive way. He became an educator inside prison, teaching mathematics, calculus, statistics. Former students and inmates reportedly respected him deeply. which creates this weird emotional contradiction in the story. Because on one hand, he traumatized innocent people for decades. On the other hand, he was clearly capable of contributing something meaningful if life had unfolded differently. That tension sits at the center of the entire Carl Gugasian story. A brilliant mind pointed in the wrong direction. On May 5, 2017, at 69 years old, Carl Gugasian walked out of prison a free man. After decades of robberies, wilderness escapes, hidden bunkers, and FBI manhunts, the Friday night bank robber quietly stepped back into society. And when you step back and look at the entire story, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Carl Gugasian spent 30 years trying to eliminate randomness from crime. He calculated everything: movement, timing, terrain, psychology, probability. But no equation can fully control life. Eventually, chance always enters the system. And in the end, the man who outsmarted the FBI, manipulated eyewitnesses, buried evidence underground, and engineered one of the most sophisticated robbery systems in American history, was ultimately undone by two teenagers exploring the woods out of boredom. That's the terrifying beauty of probability. No matter how brilliant the criminal, no matter how perfect the system, the odds of escaping forever eventually fall to zero. This is the Heist Vault. Subscribe for more true heists and robberies.